So welcome, I think we're on. So, happy belated Valentine's Day. Yesterday, we celebrated all heartfelt relationships. How important these are to humanity. And sadly, what I hear is that many more people are withdrawing or feeling that relationships are too challenging or unsatisfying. I understand. It's very difficult. It seems like it's the main issue for us to come into a world that we all want to live within. So when there's this kind of pseudo solution that we're exploring now, I think to some degree, like how do we deal with all the conflict and everything that's out here, so we can go with withdrawal, from the challenges and the pain of relationships. And that may keep us protected in some ways, but that armor will become a prison. Relationships are really the most challenging thing for us, but also our deepest longing. And we are social creatures, and so we really can try to pretend that we don't need connection, but that's all it is a pretense. And so why is it, since we're social creatures, so hard for us to find and maintain good relationships? Well, the pathwork has some really interesting answers to this sort of path within the path, and it is understood as a kind of real deep cauldron of the spiritual work that we have to do within ourselves that is brought forth in relationship, right? So, in a way, the problem with relationship is that they are this cauldron of our own personal transformation and spiritual evolution, and we want them to just be, good and cozy or whatever, but they're simply going to keep bringing up everything that we really don't want, that but it's because that's where we are in defense, and we have to work through that and find our way beyond the defense, to fully, embrace life. So it's both sort of a carrot and a stick relationship, that shapes us into these deeper, more loving humans if we are willing to undergo what it takes. And it's deeply challenging for so many of us, almost universally, right? But if we can, not feel defeated by that, but just understand that it's, that depth because of the level of significance and because of what it's asking us to discover and find. And so it can't be managed in the way that the ego wants to just manage it. So I want to sort of help us understand a little bit why it's fraught with so much difficulty. So our very first love was a natural love that the child has, and this bond that it naturally feels for its first family. These caregivers that, are supporting it as it's completely vulnerable in the world. And often these connections are fraught with conflict and pain for the very vulnerable child, and it's not always just intentional abuse or, the child has an insatiable need for connection. And the truth is that no parents can possibly supply everything and make the child always happy. And for the child, the lack is keenly felt, in all kinds of levels and ways, right? And so this becomes sort of this uh, trauma space, but it's really, I mean, the guide says if we all really knew how to love fully and healthily, that this trauma wouldn't be created. But we all know that our families of origin, our parents had their own wounds and their unmet needs. And so these things get carried on through the generations. And we actually, I think, carry, clan patterns and ancestral trauma, this way through our line. And so, this is not a small thing that we're dealing with, right? And then according to the pathwork, also, we have past lives where we've encountered experiences that, like really impacted us and traumatized us, or, we traumatized others, or, so there's this kind of level of even past life issues of our own prior soul journeys on earth that we choose to bring back in when they weren't sort of integrated in the first place. And, the good news is usually, we're seeing it from a slightly different angle. Maybe it's if we, have enough sort of positive desire and willingness, it's like it's often, given to us in a way that's where we can integrate it a little better. Um, but it's still, fraught with our old histories. And so this is part of the difficulty with relationship is that, we're never in just a relationship with one other person. We're in a relationship with this whole collective of people that each person is kind of founded within and on top of, and, brings forth all of this past. And so the past that comes into the present, and especially when the past is fraught with, suffering and, attempts to avoid suffering, the defenses, then we end up um, struggling in relationship, in ways that we have not, enough consciousness around to begin to unravel. And it kind of boils down into some kind of dynamics or old petty fights or, issues that we can't seem to get beyond. So, like there's a way that um, when we don't have our needs met, including the safety and belonging, then like the child has to try to survive, right? And so it tries to become something that it needs to be in order to make the connection, right? So it might create a mask, right? It might be submissive and loving and a good person. It might be um, somebody that just withdraws and stays hidden and quiet, whatever will help the child survive. It could be even somebody acts out and becomes the scapegoat or the problem child, right? All of these forms are ways that we're trying to manage the difficulty with the connection. And then we also within ourselves create, an idealized self-image, like a belief, if only I were a certain way, then I wouldn't have these problems. And somehow it's my fault because I'm not the way I should be, right? And so then we internalize and turn against ourselves now. That definitely adds this difficulty, in this whole dynamic of relationship. And when we're not relating, as who we really are, even if we do get somebody to like us, right, then we don't really feel secure in that because we secretly deep down inside know that they don't really know us. So by manipulating ourselves, and trying to manipulate others so we can, be safe and connected, and you know then we have to sort of control our own impulses, so we don't get rejected, and by manipulating ourselves, we're really trying to manipulate others, right, in order to get our needs met. And this will never work. It historically for all of our lives has not worked, right? It's been maybe better than nothing, maybe it works a little, right? But at the deepest level, we're never really satisfied. And it's interesting that life tends to pair people who have sort of similar dynamics and traits from our early environment. And so oftentimes our experience of new relationships are, oh, but this is somehow, seems like I'm here back in the same situation as I was before. Um, can be differences, right? But we sense that, no, there's this similar situation, and we keep finding ourselves back in the same relationship, more or less. And we begin to see that the patterns are repeating. And that's useful, like if we can, you know, be aware and recognize that there's an unconscious process going on, and not to judge or blame or think that we, should be beyond that or something like that. Um, but to get curious, to realize, oh, there's self knowledge that I don't have. There's a deeper understanding that I need. And that can really help us begin to do this journey of excavating and unraveling all of this. And then we can, transform it and, find a deeper uh, sense of security and a deeper authenticity and transparency, and joy in our relationships. And, they're never perfectly harmonious. But then when they're not, we have skills and other ways of, paying attention to those disharmonies that only add and make the totality of the relationship even richer. So ideally, relationship can be this deep source of pleasure and support and security and all kinds of wonderful things that we all long for so much. But we have to go, enter into this journey to, work through all of the projections and the images and ways that we are bringing our past relationships into the present with this one. And the good news is that that helps us resolve and integrate and, heal and make whole all of those relationships that, happened in historical situations, right? And so, we can make whole our own work. We can heal the past as well as the future as we, go forward. So, if this sounds familiar to you, and if you recognize that there's a dynamic at work in your relationship issues, then I really recommend that you take a, seek a deeper understanding. And um, I found mine, through the Pathwork, which you can find channeled material that deals a lot with our relationship dynamics in many, many ways, deals with our lack of unhappiness, our, struggles and our, difficulties. And helps us evolve and mature ourselves spiritually. So it's really a profound process, and there are many people who are trained to, you can just go read the lectures for free, but there are people that are trained to work individually. I'm one of them that, can sort of help you, bring this material forward and, discover some of this, and it's usually a little more supportive, to work with somebody. The material is dense and deep, and it would take you a while to get through all of the lectures, and then you might understand it conceptually, but to embody it, to understand it, within your own life journey is another thing. So, helpers are what we call the people that are trained to support others to unravel, these different uh, levels of, you know, longing in life that are not being met. That there is within us this desire to fulfill, the profound journey here that we understand as life, and we all feel within ourselves a sense of mission, even if we don't always understand or understand how to bring it forth. But we do realize that each lifetime is unique and important, and you know, to the degree that we can't are not giving it our best, you know, we suffer from that. And so, you know, sometimes we are not able to, or we're disheartened, you know, discouraged, and our best is hidden under layers of pain and suffering. So even in those situations, you know, the work of excavating and the work of, you know, self acceptance and self understanding, self knowledge will, you know, bring you sort of beyond the stuck places where you are, and open to a larger transformation in relationship and in all levels of life. So a loving, warm, accepting relationship really is a kind of fountain of love, you know, that is generated between people that then, you know, is affects and you know is a bounty to everyone within the orbit of that love. And this is the love that we need in the world, you know. And it really begins first with self-love, which is sort of where we're always trying to, you know, get that love from the other person first. um, and then even if they give it to us, we can't really receive it if we don't have a good relationship with ourselves. So the love we need in the world, you know, has to begin with like exploring where we are withholding this love from ourselves. And then as we discover who we really are, you know, this true self knowledge, um, of you know everything that we're carrying, including our wounds, but you know what are our gifts, and you know what is our longing. You know, we begin to recognize, you know, this sort of gift that we are to the world, and that our love, whatever that love is for, is part of that gift. And we want to share that, and that is what creates the relationship. So if we're unhappy, there's something that's not happening where we're, you know, bringing forth that love. And what is blocking it is what the work of you know the path is of uncovering and of releasing the parts of us that, you know, got lost in a way, and went into you know sort of the place of, you know, trying to protect ourselves with defense rather than with the inner wisdom of our higher selves. So we're definitely, you know, as we just face and experience and listen to our deep inner experiences, um, and we have to be willing then to tolerate discomfort, you know, some pain, but the value of this deep listening is wonderful, because we really can see ourselves then, and we can, you know, understand, you know, this love we need in the world begins with self-love that's born of our true self-knowledge of who we are. And we have this part that's always, you know, looking at ourselves and judging or criticizing ourselves, and that's this interject from the past, you know, so we can't, that voice does not help us with true self-knowledge or self-love. And so we have to awaken a part of our, you know, inner being, which we all have, but it's not something we're so naturally familiar with. It's not taught in the world. So this is a part of this work that we can, you know, find this true self-knowledge of who we are and what we came to teach, and what we're here learning. And that self-knowledge accepts self-responsibility and understands like that we're creating our life by our consciousness in some very specific ways that are, you know, help to be understood, you know, through following paths like the Pathwork. And then without shame or blame, but with deep self-acceptance, because we know who we are and we know what we're working on, that we can, like move forward and feel and face and, support and transform. So the shadow is owned and it's not projected onto the other, which is often the case in most unconscious relationships. And and when we can really appreciate and know ourselves and love ourselves, and I get that, we have many things that we don't like and are not lovable, and, but that's not all of who we are, and it's not even who we are. Who we are is that which is carrying those imperfect aspects, um, in order to help purify them, right? In order to help heal. And so when we recognize that, we're not these faults, we're not these problems, but we are the uh, being that is bringing them into incarnation in order to, bring them into experience where they can be deeply acknowledged, understood, and transformed. Right? And so there's a kind of profound, honoring of each human being here on this earth. Um, and the mind, the ego, often, like belittles the depth of who we are. It doesn't really understand it. It only sees from very limited perspectives. Like, are you rich? Are you famous? Are you, important? Are you better than others? Right? It's kind of like lost in a sort of competitive and comparative evaluation, and so it's always then unhappy ultimately and insecure. So we're going, deeper into connecting with this relationship with ourself, that is really with our true nature, our higher self. And that part of us can then be the center and hold all of the other parts. And then when we can be in that beautiful relationship with ourselves, we will, be in relationship beautifully with others. And we don't have to be there perfectly, right? But when we know that our feathers are ruffled or we're in some kind of reaction with our partner, then we can, begin to take it inside and, look within at our history where it might be resonant. And also, if we're, blessed enough to, be in a relationship where both partners can explore and look at this co-creation and see how actually, you know, one person's defense is triggering the other person's projected, assumption about what that defense is about, which probably isn't really what it's about. And then they're defending against what they're projecting, right? And so there's this, way that we get very lost and confused in unreality in these particular dynamics where we have these old wounds. So most of us, if we're honest, have difficulty with relationship. And it seems lately that relationship in general in all kinds has gotten even more fraught with pain and strife. So I just lost my place. I was sort of sharing from this notes here, and it jumped, and I can't find where I was. So anyway, let me just begin somewhere. Um, so when our relationships are unconscious, we're often relating from these wounded aspects of our unmet needs from early primary relationships. And from there, we're either submitting, trying to get our way with power and will, or we're withdrawing in the relationship, sort of a kind of, I don't need it, I don't need you, you don't matter kind of separation. And in those different strategies, we're hoping to finally get what we didn't get from the family of religion. So, when we're looking for this warm, loving, accepting relationship, this fountain of love, that can be such a part of everybody, and this richness that we're deep in our being seeking, and we're having difficulty finding it because what we're meeting is with each other's defenses. And so what we forget is that we have these relationship programs that are running from the unconscious, and they do go back to our original relationships. So when we were incredibly vulnerable and dependent, and so these programs were built to manage our situation when we were otherwise powerless, and they helped us survive, but we don't realize how much we still are operating from them, and how much the situation has changed. In fact, we're kind of projecting or reading it sort of hyper vigilantly, expecting it to be out there, and how much the old hurts from childhood are still deeply affecting all of our adult relationships. So some of this work is beautiful in that it naturally helps us reconnect with those old wounds, and bring a conscious presence there that was needed at the time but wasn't available. And then we can make that available for ourselves now, and those old wounds can be healed. So what is a mature relationship like? The pathwork refers to this as a deep experience of mutuality, a deep intimacy that come from self-revealing. So we have to really not be afraid of sharing ourselves with another person, which means we have to trust them. And of course, like our distrust is a part of a defense, that like we're kind of like got our antenna out, waiting for them to show up in a certain way that we recognize was dangerous from the past. And then we immediately have our defenses present. Sometimes they're attacking, or asking for something, saying that we're not happy with what we're being given. Sometimes we're withdrawing, sometimes we're trying to go along with, but we're secretly resenting it. So there's different ways that we've been trying to hide. And so this is where in a healthy relationship, like we need to be aware of these things, we need to own these things, we need to share what our feelings are, but it's not just sharing our blame or our judgment, right? It's not just sharing from the projection of our own wound, but it's more like understanding that, and then a deep intimacy can happen as we each understand each other. Oh, you're reacting to this part of your childhood history and wounding, and I can have empathy for that, I can have compassion for that, and I can recognize, and maybe you can, hopefully, it requires that, realize, oh, I'm not doing that in the same way that it was done to you before. And so you can drop your need to protect yourself or dominate or whatever that is, and and we can come back into a kind of mutuality. And this has to happen on both sides. If I get triggered by your being triggered, there's both people have to do the work. And I like this a lot because it's never about one partner is the problem. It's always this co-creation, this mutuality that in some ways is brilliant. If we could understand that. I know it's painful and it's difficult when we're in these places, but from a more objective position, and ideally one can see that in their own relationships. You begin to recognize the brilliance of the universe, and keeping your feet in the fire, in a sense, so that you don't not do the healing work, the evolutionary spiritual work that you came to do. And everything that we encountered in childhood, according to the understanding of the pathwork, was chosen in our pre incarnatory position, like, oh, this next life I want to work on this, I want to bring this back in another form, so that I can examine it again and try to find a beautiful way through, right? And to heal an old wound from another lifetime. But then usually we choose circumstances in childhood that will activate that in the present, so we don't really have to remember the past life dynamic, because it is reset up in the early parts of this life. And then it's kind of uh, the lecture, the lesson, the problem on the blackboard that we came in to work with. And there may be more than one, but we often have a sort of major, sort of thing that then connects with others, but configures around this. So let me maybe go back a little and just repeat this. So where there are negative patterns that happen between people, ideally the both partners can go beyond this adversarial position and see this mutuality in both the harmony and the disharmony. And if a good outcome, if so, a good outcome is very likely, because when we can, like, take it on in this mutual way, it's the most beautiful, really. You can also do this work even though your partner is not available for it, and it will yield amazing results. But it's beautiful when there's a conscious relationship where both parties can look at the disharmony as a co-creation and seek to find their part. And then, with the link to the old trauma, which can then be helped to heal. And then we see how life has helped us to encounter, once again, these problematic childhood lacks, so that we can uncover and heal this wound that is still within us. And it needs to be, present and alive, and as conscious as possible. So, these new relationship problems that come from these old relationship dynamics are a part of the way that the universe helps us be focused and, work with these underlying consciousness aspects of our situation. So the partner that triggers us, may be like the wrong partner in some sense, but I mean, we don't have to stay with the partner forever. The guide says, particularly if there's harm, between people in those situations. But all relationships can be useful, right? So even if it's quote unquote not the final one, or the one that you're really seeking for, it may actually be the perfect one in that moment to build up this presence and this capacity to help you grow beyond your old reactions and dynamics, so that finding that will be completed, in a sense, as part of the job, and maybe not be triggered in the other relationship that you may come to next. But every relationship has value, and can be utilized in this way as a stepping stone on this ladder of our own spiritual evolution. And that doesn't mean that we stay in abusive or painful relationships like that. Um, Part of the learning might be in that situation, how to say no, and to have boundaries, and to not remain in those circumstances. But they're still always there for our edification. And often we insist that it's the other person that should change, and they're the problem. And there's a way, again, where that can be even true, that there can be an element of that, but the best practice, again, is for both partners to see this interwoven creation, and then take it on each one's self to recognize the misconceptions and the projections that are responsible for your own fear and unhealthy needs to control, right? Uh, the closed heart, the lack of love, the defensiveness, right? What we want to do is like ultimately live an undefended life, right? And the defenses are only the source of more pain, even though we think that they are there to protect us from the pain. The truth is, we need to embrace the pain. That the avoidance of the pain, the fear of the pain, the projection of the pain. Life has pain. It's like suffering is another thing, and the suffering is what we cause ourselves, by resisting and, trying to control the pain. But if we can learn the difference and learn, to surrender and accept a certain, healthy, feedback, and we live in the field of time, there's grief, there's loss, life is not a vacation, it's an initiation. And so all of these things are helping us grow, and our relationships most of all. So we were meant to belong. We incarnated with this vast history to our belonging, and that includes a lot of loss of belonging, the pain of not belonging. So we're ultimately trying to, heal that, to find the deepest truth about who we are and who we are to each other, how to belong together, to belong to another, to belong to a tribe, a group of brothers and sisters, a team. We were not meant to withdraw from the difficulties of relating, but rather to use those difficulties as a springboard, as a map, as a guide to our own healing and spiritual growth. And to keep, posing until we can answer deep within, posing the question, within ourselves, so we can know the truth that, love is our nature, that, we can never really be separate, that we're not a victim, that nobody, is doing anything to us. But, through our difficulties is how we begin to recognize, how to navigate in life. So if you're feeling defensive, there's some work within yourself you need to do. And if you keep trying to lay the blame on the other person, even if you're partly right, it's not going to, be the full answer that you're seeking, and most likely you'll just, create irreconcilable conflict in that relationship, right? When we point fingers, it never brings the connection that we're seeking. So you would still feel basically the sting of your own unhappiness with yourself, even if you, are sure that it's the other person, and even if the other person takes some of that self-responsibility, like if you can't find your own key, in this creation, then you're still gonna not be happy. And sometimes we can see what we're doing, but that's what makes us unhappy, right? So then we get unhappy at ourselves, and this kind of unhappiness goes back to that, relationship that we have to have with ourselves. And if we get unhappy with ourselves, it makes it very difficult for us to find our way through, to learn, to grow, to celebrate with joy, and have an ability to feel connection. So the first problematic relationship is within ourselves. And since we internalize these early criticisms and judgments from our earliest authorities, we have to first discover these splits within ourselves. A lot of what we're experiencing from other people is something, that is internalized, and we're actually doing it to ourselves and then projecting it onto others. And so rather than project them and battle them out between people, it's better to see if we can really work with and integrate them within ourselves. And when we're trying to get it from the other guy, it's a kind of codependency. And it makes the partner responsible for our happiness, And if we don't find our own responsibility, we're going to remain in a state of dependency on others. And, this is basically then where, we have this neediness that they push away, or, we don't feel like we deserve to be fulfilled or whatever, but we still feel like we can't receive what we deeply need. And so it's a real key to first make that connection more fully within yourself. And there's a beautiful process that I offer that I call deep listening soul whispering, that, get in touch with me through earthwalkways.com, and, let's do some work there, because there's a real beautiful way of integration that it's, done in concert with sort of this deeper understanding that the pathwork gives of the spiritual path, but has a very, practical way of applying and helping to make that healing within ourselves. So, and then beyond that, once we're, like, no matter what, but if we're in this higher potential of relationship, which is what we truly deeply long for. Everybody is seeking it, and that's why we're frustrated when we can't find it, not recognizing that, that the lack of it is, a cause and effect within us that we have to uncover. But let me go and give you a description from the Pathwork Lectures about the anatomy, of a healthy relationship. And this is what we long for. But in the school of relationship, we accept the teacher and accept its greater wisdom beyond our limited understanding. So why are you with that person? The Pathwork says we chose it for our own sole reasons. And why does this kind of pain keep playing out over and over? We have we have to ask if we found the original experiences that kind of conditioned us, and where we attach some pleasure actually, and we don't believe there can be anything more, and so we get attached and lost in the pain and the fear. And then can we suspend our fears and judgments, our defenses, long enough to go deeper into the true understanding for ourselves and for each partner? For each of us are playing out our own ancient dramas, right? And then when we can sort of become partners of understanding in that, and we can work together, it's like really cool. So according to the sources, a real mature relationship is a beautiful venture where both partners commit to mutual soul development and total self-responsibility. It's not merely a social or financial contract, but a dynamic spiritual interaction that serves as a mirror for each person's inner state. So here's a breakdown of what a mature relationship looks like in practice. Number one, total self-responsibility. In a mature relationship, partners stop the guilt-shifting blame. We don't make it, about the other person. We can maybe see where somehow, something they're doing is triggering us, but then we have to work with our own reactions in that. And the answer isn't in, making them the problem. So we want to own projections. Partners understand that if we are disturbed by the other, that the cause is within us, right? That there is something that is going on, that other person may be doing, but how we're filtering it, how it's coming into us, comes through our filter. And that filter has, deep unconscious past. And so the trigger is often coming from that. And so we want to then explore, we want to pay attention. Oh, there's like something going on here. Let me pay attention. Let me look deeper. The 50-50 rule. While one person may be blatantly at fault, and sometimes that does happen, that it's clearly sort of one-sided, and the other more mature partner, is really not engaging at the same level. it's still their responsibility in the natural kind of way that this process works, that the mature partner also searches for any of their own negative involvement in any friction. So even when it seems so obvious that it's like one person is being the one that's acting out, doing, creating all of the friction, that there's always a way that both people are involved. And it's so powerful when, each person can look at their own 50%. There are no victims. Both individuals realize they are co-creators of every momentary flaw or deadness in the relationship, right? So even if, the person, never does enough work around the house or whatever it is, right? It's like that, there's somehow a co-creation in that. And so definitely the person that's, in resistance, perhaps, defending their not doing things, that person, can look at what's underneath that, what's really happening. Don't just defend it, but understand deeply what the inner no is coming from, and the other person, maybe, in their, like sort of trying to get equivalency, right? And they're coming across with a forcing current, with a certain demandingness that, even the best of us have trouble responding to with a yes, right? So the guide says it's important that we ask for our needs to be met, right? But we can't really demand them. And if we don't ask, we're not going to get them met. But if we are not willing to hear the other person say I can't right now, or no, it's not for me, or whatever, and be okay, then there's this demand, right? And so it's good to look deeply where you have a forcing current and a demand. There's usually a deep wounding in there. It's a part of a defense, and it will help you to, hold what's there for yourself, and then it won't show up in the relationship in this particular way. So, radical transparency, right? So the sources define a mature union as being totally open and transparent, where there are no secrets. So, most egoic relationships, like don't believe in this rule. But this is where, this is a deep level of commitment to a partner, and it will have a very deep result for your soul, positively, when you can do this. And anything less than this will, be a good learning experience, right? Um, but you may mostly learn, like what doesn't work rather than what does work. This is what works. Sharing the process. Partners reveal their internal soul process, including their struggles, fears, and even their difficulty in being open. So again, like if you can't feel safe or secure in sharing and being open, what you can do to be transparent, to be real, is to honor, to acknowledge, like, oh, I know I need to or would like to, but I'm afraid I can't. And then again, looking deeper into what's going on there, not necessarily assuming that, because maybe you feel unsafe with your partner, that it's really true that your partner is unsafe. It might be true, but it also might be that, the way that you are, defending yourself is actually bringing out of them, their frustration or their way of, coming at you that doesn't feel safe. So again, there's this kind of these vicious circles and these loop-to-loops between people that are happening energetically. And if we can't sort of become conscious of that, it just gets acted out unconsciously. And, people sometimes just stop and go, to their corners and lick their wounds to come back maybe and fight another day, but it doesn't get resolved. So sharing the process is really important, to speak of all of our struggles, our fears, and our difficulties with each other. Again, not blaming them, but owning, and saying, it's like, I hear that you need this, or I would like to, but I'm working with my own inner resistance, and then you need to do that work either with your partner or, with a helper, so that you can look deeper and clear that, right? To learn to risk being open, you know, not feeling like if you share your fears that you're being wimpy and you should always be the strong one in the relationship or something like that, right? There's all of kinds of levels with this. So, similarly, there's this unmasked revealing where you drop your idealized self images, right? How you think you should be, and you try to allow your real and vulnerable selves to meet. So, we all have these, personas that we want to project into the world, to feel secure and feel like that's, how people will see us, or, connect with us, and how we want them to, see us. But in these deeper relationships, that can maybe work in certain situations, but in real intimacy, in deeper relationships, we have to, drop those masks. And, for our own selves, the idealized self image is an inner tyrant of the worst order. And if we feel like we need to have that up with our partner, right, then we're not in open vulnerability with the partner. And so maybe that is, you know it's not trustworthy, and maybe you need to leave the partner, but you need to go in and look more at, what your fears are, and see if they are not from old projections or old uh, feeling states. So number 3 is an endless search for the other, right? So a mature relationship avoids the pitfall of habit and stagnation, right? So like when I first read this, I was thinking, oh, like this part of us that is constantly looking for the one and only, so that's not the kind of endless search for the other that we want to support. But we do want to support a deep, endless search for the one that we already have, right? Because who they are is so deep, so profound, so beyond what we know of them, even though we might have lived together for 40, 50, 60 years, right? There's always more. The soul is, an eternal mystery. And so if we are sort of stagnant, if we, are relating to each other in habitual forms, it's better to realize, that we're not seeking to find the other, or the other is not sharing with us at this depth of revealing that is needed for that to be shared. And so again, an endless search for the other. A mature relationship avoids the pitfall of habit and stagnation by recognizing that the human soul is endless. So, if we're bored with somebody, it's because we've stopped looking, or they've stopped revealing, or both. So, renewing eros is one element of this, where the partners use the initial spark of attraction, which is the erotic spark, is the eros, is the experience of the adventure of discovering another soul, and this kind of, fun repartee that we have in early relationships, sort of the honeymoon phase, where you bring out the best in them and they bring out the best in you, and it's like it's a beautiful and exciting and wonderful kind of connection. And that connection doesn't ever have to get stagnant. It doesn't ever have to get old or leave. Um, it often does, because people get lazy, or people go into old habits and assumptions, or we're no longer seeking the other. We're no longer looking deep enough to find that new part of this endless soul that we're connected to. Another aspect is constant aliveness, because the couples are always revealing new layers of themselves, right? The relationship remains built on a rock and never becomes static, right? You're sharing with each other, and you're growing, ideally, right? So if you're stagnant, then you're not expanding your own potential, and then you're not revealing it to your partner. And so there's this kind of synergy that happens with constant aliveness, where you're finding new parts of yourself and revealing them to your partner, or your partner is pulling them out of you, you're pulling them out of your partner. um, and this deepens the connection and the intimacy more and more, and the solidness, the sort of built on a rock state, and the aliveness of the relationship will be, deeply rewarding. So number 4 is fusion of all levels. So maturity leads to a fusion that is not just physical, but includes the emotional, mental, and spiritual energy bodies. So, when there's a deep merging and oneness that we can get to, ultimately we are one with all of humanity, and we are always another yourself, there. And then with these deep, intimate relationships and our main partners, there's this, depth of exchange from all of these levels of our being. And so on the level of divine reality, it says, through this total fusion, partners experience the divine presence in themselves and each other, turning the relationship into a holy ritual. I love this one. So when we are, really open and connected, then we do experience this divine presence, both in ourselves, our depth of love, our, uh, beautiful, shine that is brought out of us by the beautiful love of the other person, right? And so, we experience sort of each other's divine presence most fully. And I love this in that way, turning the relationship into a holy ritual. Complementary balance. Both individuals work to balance the internal masculine and feminine qualities. So masculine is the active intellectual, and the feminine is sort of the passive intuitive qualities. I would say receptive more than even passive, right? It's like how I understand these two principles, and they're, within everything in nature, is this, active impulse of, focused intention, and this receptive space of life force unfolding and welcoming and being with everything. And there's this balancing, that each partner, if one partner is active, the other partner can receive that. And when the other partner is receptive, the other partner, can take on the active role. So it's a very beautiful dance when you have this, and the harmony between these active and receptive principles are, really what creates the deepest pleasure and the greatest joy in life. And the most beautiful creativity. I mean, this is where creativity comes from, is the marriage of the masculine and the feminine principles, and everything that is manifested and created comes out of this balance of the receptive and the active, and channeling these energies in the right way, so that the guide says sometimes we, are active when we should be receptive, and we're receptive when we should be active. So there's this, timing as well in this dance of complementary balance. And then number 5, this is actually an AI summary of these points in the lectures, and it says a nucleus of strength. A mature relationship is not an isolated unit of separateness. Instead, it becomes a nucleus of strength, where the partners fortify each other to undertake a commonly undertaken task for the greater cause. So it might be, for the family, or for, a career, or a larger, gifting into the universe. And through the partnership, it's like that sustains and, helps fortify, the success of that kind of task. So ultimately, the sources argue that a relationship is a gauge of one's spiritual maturity. The deeper the capacity for relatedness and unmasked revealing, the more developed the individual is. Does this idea of a relationship being a nucleus of strength for a larger purpose change how you see your personal connections? Do you see your relationships primarily as a private refuge? So, just a few kind of in questions that AI dropped in there. So the pathwork is a tested and a proven path to sort of these deep, mutual, intimate kinds of relationships. And it all takes the work of our, evolving, our immature childhood aspects that, got traumatized and didn't grow up very well, and they're still, struggling with that. And so, with the support of the work of the helpers, of the programs in the pathwork, we can definitely fill in these gaps and, transform the difficulties. So, and like I said before, even just one person doing the work can make all the difference. And that was my case. My husband did not, join this path, um, and yet, in so many ways, the more that I allowed myself to take full self responsibility and work within myself, the more that he blossomed in his loving capacity. So I very much, agree that, like oftentimes it's just the edgy dynamic between us. And so the guide often says is that the partner that's, more capable, more spiritually mature, can make the gesture, can make the difference and transform the dynamics. And my husband also, even though he doesn't do this path, he has a great deal of his own spiritual maturity. Um, so, again, it's like healthy in relationship. Like I can let you do your path, I can do my path. We don't have to do the same path. And yet, in that freedom and in that self responsibility, we both flourish. And so it's never about, who's at fault, but just about seeing that, there is a painful dynamic within us, and that's basically just trying to be activated so that we can take it on and do the work of transforming it into this more mature and real relationship that we're longing for. And so that's the taking of the responsibility to, you know, create it within our own worlds. So I hope this was useful and kind of a reminder of, how to really seed and water and nurture, a beautiful and healthy relationship. And if you feel like there's parts of your own inner dynamics that, you're struggling with, please connect with me, give me a call, send me an email. Um, I can give a free intro session that will help me determine if this is, work that's available, that you can do this kind of work, that it makes sense, and, we're on enough of the same page, and also that you can see how it feels to work with me, and then if that's a good connection, we can plan on scheduling at least several sessions to see, how that can deepen you into this state of your own. Probably where it would start is within our own relationships, right, to ourselves. And so it always begins there, even when it's around and centered around our partners or our bosses or our, sisters and brothers, however that is. It's ultimately the work of seeing where that connects to our own inner wounding and our own self judgment and our own demands, that try to control ourselves and others to find our way forward into safety and flourishing. And control won't ever do it. So we have to let go of the reins. We have to trust in life, in God, in ourselves, and and in the feelings that we can actually feel through and come out more whole and more safe and more resilient and um, more powerful on the other side. Okay, so happy belated Valentine's Day, everybody. And may your relationships find the depth of, power within them as these teachers, as these, help showing, reflecting us what we need to see for our own deep work. Okay, thank you, everybody. Signing off. Take care.